Welcome to Sigest, your fortnightly serving of digestible science from plant and food research.
Kia ora koutou katoa. Welcome to Sigest. I'm your host, Hilary Island, and today we are delighted to speak with food evangelist Jack Bobo. Jack is currently Executive Director of the UCLA Rothman Family Institute for Food Studies, which explores the intersect of food, environment, culture and society, locally and globally. Jack's extensive experience spans roles as the Director of Global Food and Water Policy at the Nature Conservancy, CEO of Futurity, a food foresight company, and Senior Advisor on Global Food Policy at the US Department of State. Jack is the author of Why Smart People Make Bad Food Choices, which unpacks the influence of behavioural science, food environments and policy on food system design, and Jack covered many of these topics in his TED Talk as well. Jack is visiting New Zealand to speak at the Life Sciences Summit in Wellington, and we're very excited to have Jack join us today. Kia ora, Jack. Welcome to New Zealand and welcome to Sigest.
Thank you.
Your journey is fascinating. You hold a JD, an MS in environmental science, a BS in biology, and a BA in psychology and chemistry. You worked in the Peace Corps, and you've held an impressive range of roles. Can you reflect on how your background and varied endeavours shaped your interdisciplinary approach to food system design?
Yeah, thank you. It's wonderful to be on the podcast as well. So I spent 13 years with the U.S. government doing global food policy, and during that time I spent a few years covering Africa food policy, Asia food policy, Europe food policy, and then spent a few years working on, as the senior advisor for biotechnology. But I think perhaps the most interesting, I spent time just giving talks. So I had an unlimited travel budget, could travel anywhere in the world and just talk about the future of food, the role of science, and how do we better communicate and engage with the public. And it was really during that time that I came to recognize that science at the beginning of a conversation often polarized the audience. Those who agreed with you more, but often those who disagreed more. And so I kind of went back to my psychology roots, and I wanted to look at cognitive science and behavioral science and marketing and advertising, trying to understand how do people come to believe what they believe and know what they know, and when do people change their minds? And so I've been on a journey, I suppose, for the last 20 or so years, trying to unpack how can we communicate in ways that bring people together to solve problems rather than further polarize the debate. And I think that's one of the challenges that we face today. And according to the World Economic Forum, the number one risk to society is misinformation, and the number 3 or 4 is polarization. And so these are really big challenges.
100%, incredibly big challenges. Speaking of the challenge ahead and the people that are needed to address the challenge, I've heard you say that the creation of sustainable, nutritious food systems will require the effort from everyone. And true to your integrated approach, you really do mean everyone, from consumers to vendors to producers and food policy regulators. Can you explain how each of these groups influence the creation of sustainable food systems of the future?
Yeah, so it is a real food system, and one of the things that I think is important is we just need to recognize that there are trade-offs in virtually every decision we make. And so there are no easy answers. There's no right answer. There's just the answer that works best for any particular society. Often point out that science tells us what we can do, but it's society that tells us what we should do. And so we need to be part of a conversation, because, a tragedy would be, getting to 2050 and failing to address the challenges we face. But it would be a greater challenge if we had all the tools available and we still failed to do it because we didn't bring the public along. Mm-hmm. And so I think that's a big part of having conversations, engaging with people and understanding what do people want, how do we get there, so that society doesn't just sort of accept technology. They demand innovation. And if the public were demanding innovation, then policymakers would be funding it. And if they were funding it, they'd make sure the regulations were fit for purpose. And so we need to have these conversations much earlier than just at the point of deploying new technologies.
Yeah, I mean, how do we go about enhancing those communication channels between all of the different people involved?
Well, I think part of it is we need to be better at understanding sort of our own biases. It's easy to want to go out and try to convince people that they're wrong, but we often aren't open to the possibility that we're wrong as well. that, we need to learn, or we need to be just as open-minded. And one of the examples I like to give is, I'll ask an audience, if they know about confirmation bias. And most people do, the idea that we seek out information that's consistent with our beliefs and we discount information that's inconsistent. But, we're all really good at identifying bias in other people. Mm-hmm. We're terrible at identifying bias in ourselves. and that's part of it, is that humility to recognize that we are also biased. And so sometimes I'll give an example and I'll point out that, if I read an article that said organic food was more nutritious than conventional, well, I'm a little bit doubtful that that's the case. And so I would ask, who are the authors, who funded the research, and what was their methodology? Now, those are pretty reasonable things to do anytime you have a question. But what would happen if the article said organic, no more nutritious than conventional? Mm-hmm. I'd tweet it. Or exit. I don't really know what we do anymore. But it's this idea that if it's consistent with your beliefs, you don't ask tough questions. And when it's not, you do. And so we feel like we're being fair when we ask our opponents or those who disagree with us tough questions, but we're just not asking ourselves those questions. And so I think the ability to have that sort of personal insight. And, another example, there's something called the availability heuristic, which is a complicated way of saying what things come to mind when I say a word. So, for example, if I say the word natural, your listeners might be thinking rainbows and butterflies and puppies, but they're probably not thinking E. coli, salmonella, and Ebola. Mm-hmm. And those things are all natural too. And so, our mind just goes to a happy place when we hear the word natural. It's like, ooh, that sounds good. I'll pay more. And what does it mean? I have no idea. And so, again, I think it's always worth keeping in mind that we should not trust our brains. Our brains are leading us astray all the time. We think it knows what it's doing, but it often doesn't.
Gosh, that's challenging. It's already a lot of information that we need to process. So to also question how we're processing it, it's yet another variable. You mentioned the cognitive bias around the term natural. And when many of us spend every single moment of our lives benefiting from man-made creations and endeavours, why do we still have that particular mental shortcut? And how much of it is a barrier to achieving these sustainable food systems that we want to develop for the future?
Yeah, so the naturalness bias, I think, most people, most places have it. And, it's not really surprising. We have a little bit of chemophobia. We think, chemical sounds bad. And we forget that food is made of chemicals. And so some of those things, it's just how our mind operates. And so we shouldn't be surprised about it. We should just sort of accept that we're going to do these things. And I think that, the more aware we are of the fact that our mind is going to lead us astray, just the better position we're going to be in. And, when people say, well, if you can't pronounce the ingredients in a food, you shouldn't eat it. It's like, well, I suspect we can't pronounce the ingredients in most foods, even whole foods. But there's a difference between beating somebody up with science and leading them to knowledge. We all like to learn things. We don't like to be told things. And so how we communicate is just critically important.
Absolutely. Speaking of the communication, how do we rebrand man-made?
Well, I think part of that is if people understood the historical context for innovation, they would think about it differently. And so people say, well, I don't want preservatives in my food. Well, and that's because our food is pretty darn safe. Mm-hmm. And we forget that 100 years ago, our food would kill us, and preservatives came along and, helped dramatically reduce that. And we think of brands as a mark of quality, but a brand arose as a promise not to kill the consumer. And over time, it became a mark of quality. So it went from being a ceiling, something we aspire to a floor that we expect. And, it takes a little bit of effort to recognize that food doesn't have to be safe, that food wasn't always safe, and that there's a reason that it is safe. And so providing people with that historic context hopefully will make them more interested in their food because they understand where it came from and more open to the trade-offs inherent in something like a preservative. Yeah, preservatives, you might worry about it, but it makes food last longer. It reduces food waste. It makes food more affordable. And so there are trade-offs in those choices. So you can choose not to have it, but you're going to have to go to the grocery store more often. You have perhaps a higher risk of food safety issues. And many people, are struggling with affordability of food. And so it could impact them. And so recognizing those trade-offs, I think, can help us to think differently about what mankind has delivered.
Humankind, yeah.
Yes, exactly.
That's right. So if our goal is to create sustainable, nutritious food systems of the future, what baseline are we starting from? How big is the challenge? And is there a timeline we need to be bearing in mind?
Yeah, so in many ways, there's nothing we do that has a bigger, more negative impact on the planet than agriculture. But there's nothing more critical for our daily survival. So the challenge we have is how to maintain and grow the benefits and reduce those negatives. To put that in context, 40% of all the land on Earth that could be used for agriculture is being used for agriculture today. The amount of cropland is the size of South America. The amount of pasture land is the size of Africa. So just nothing more important than agriculture. If we were talking about fresh water, 70% of all fresh water goes to agriculture. The United States, the Colorado River, the fifth largest river in America, no longer flows to the sea. So these aren't the challenges of 2050. These are the realities of today. And if we were to talk about climate change, 10 to 15% of greenhouse gas emissions come directly from agriculture. Another 10 to 15% come from deforestation, 80% of which is caused by agriculture. And so that's almost as much as energy and more than anything else. And so there's a tremendous footprint for agriculture that we have today. But I also think it's really important that we understand where we've come from, because people hear these numbers and they feel like, wow, agriculture is bad and it's going to get worse because we're going from 8 to 9.5 billion people. We need 25 to 75% more food. So everything is going to get harder. And I think it's easy to sort of despair a little bit about our future when we hear these statistics. And I think that's why a lot of young people are a little apathetic or worried about their future. And so I think it's useful to sort of step back and think about, well, has innovation failed us? And I like to give an example outside of agriculture first. And if we were talking about something like CO2 emissions, I spent the last couple of years in the UK. So per capita emissions are 5.5 tons per person, higher than the global average. Listeners may not know, but it's a terrible number. And again, it's the sort of thing that makes people worried. And that's because we're looking at it from today. That's the number. But it's also a 150-year low. And all of a sudden, when people realize it's like, wow, it's a 150-year low and it's dropping fast, all of a sudden it can seem optimistic. Wow, we can do this. We can get these challenges under control. And so understanding that context, and if we were to look at the same thing for agriculture, childhood mortality is at the lowest point in all of human history. Without agricultural innovation, we would need dramatically more cropland. And to put that into perspective, there are about 3.6 billion hectares of forest on the planet. And if we were farming today with 1960s technology, we'd need 1 billion additional hectares of land. That's more than a quarter of all the forest on the planet only exists because of agricultural innovation. And so that's part of the reason why it's really important to understand where we've come from, to appreciate where we are so that we can plan on where we want to go.
Yeah, when you put it like that, relatively speaking, it's a wonder. You mentioned the statistic around the 150-year low of carbon emissions, was it?
Yes.
Right. Does that take into the export of production off the coast?
So that's a great question. Right now, CO2 emissions are calculated based on where they're produced. And so for the most part, that means that their overall emissions, have gone down. But, food is one of those complicated things where today, under the current climate rules, if a country produces no food, it has no food emissions. And I suspect that's not really true. And so one of the things that I worry about is that the current climate rules are not really fit for purpose when it comes to agriculture. And the reason is that it can really encourage countries to produce less food and then import it. And then you end up with the countries that are producing food being those that are outside the system. And, they're not part of the climate convention. And ultimately, you could be increasing or decreasing emissions. You just don't know because it's focused on it's zero emissions if you're producing it. And that's why at some point we're going to have to go to something like a carbon border adjustment mechanism. You get charged for the things you import and you get a credit for the things that you export. And I think that would benefit a country like New Zealand, and it would benefit the world because New Zealand is a very efficient producer. And you could meet your net zero obligations by just not exporting food, but the world would be a worse place, particularly for those things that you're very efficient at producing. And so I think we need to keep that in mind, that, the impact of trade.
Absolutely. That's a really complicated landscape. This week, you gave a keynote talk at the Life Sciences Summit, and that was a conference which explored the future of the New Zealand biotech ecosystem. Which technologies do you think hold the most promise for advancing biotech and food production in New Zealand and globally?
So I think it's a variety of technologies that we're going to need. It's an entire ecosystem, and there's not sort of a single technology, not a single product that's going to be able to do it. But I do think things like gene editing hold promise because they're a tool and they cut across a lot of different products. So from livestock production to plant production and fruit and vegetables and all sorts of things. And particularly in a place like New Zealand, where 50% of your emissions come from the food sector. And it's just hard to reduce some of those emissions because you're already such an efficient producer. And so you really will need new technologies and new management practices in order to do that. And some of that will be gene technology, some of that will be robotics, AI. A lot of different technologies are coming along that I think are going to sort of dramatically change the footprint. And that's really critical because the next 25 years are potentially the most important 25 years there will ever be for agriculture.
Why is that?
So I think when most people think about the future, they stop thinking about the future in 2050. And so they think, okay, well, we're going to add 1.5 billion people in the next 25 years. That's a huge problem. And we're going to just have to keep producing more and more food forever. And the reality is that's not true. After 2050, population growth slows dramatically. We're going to add 1 billion people every 25 or 30 years after 2050, and we're going to add 1 billion people every 12 or 13 years right now. So population is growing quickly. It's going to slow dramatically, and population will almost certainly be below its peak by 2100, maybe even back down to 8.5 billion people. And so the challenge we face is not to produce more and more food forever. It's to get to 2050 without screwing things up. We need to get there without cutting down our forest and without draining our rivers or lakes and aquifers, because if we do, in many ways, we're good forever. And for those who are wondering, why is population going to slow dramatically? Well, we've already reached peak child. The number of children born next year will be less than this year, and less the year after that, the year after that, the year after that. We already know that's happened. The 100% of population growth is because of people living longer. It's a good news story about health and nutrition, but we probably won't live forever unless Elon Musk has something to do with it. So at some point, population slows and begins to decline. And so the next 25 years are not just the most important 25 years there have ever been in the 10,000-year history of agriculture, and they're also the most important 25 years there will ever be in the history of agriculture. And that's why we need to get it right, and that's why this moment is so important.
Yes.
But we need the public, we need policymakers, we need everybody to be on board with developing the innovation, the tools in order for us to get there. And just to keep in mind that for 10,000 years, farmers were asked to do one thing: produce more food. We're at that one unique moment in all of human history where they're asked now to produce better food. Better for people and better for the planet. And so that's going to be a complicated change in what we've done from the past, but it's absolutely critical.
And noble. It's great. It's an exciting moment.
It is.
In history, really. So you were talking about gene technology, and as you know, New Zealand is currently reviewing the gene technology laws, and there's a range of views across the population, as I'm sure there are in all other countries. So what factors are important for all of us to consider when we're wanting to benefit from food system innovations through adoption of new agricultural technologies? So not only bringing consumers' minds along, but what do all of the players in the food system need to consider?
Yeah. And, I don't really see myself as an advocate for gene technology or any particular technology. I see our food system benefits from its diversity. And that diversity includes organic production, it includes regenerative agriculture, agroecology. They're all part of a continuum of sustainability. And, I like to talk in terms of sort of local sustainability versus global. And what I mean by that is that sort of organic has a lighter impact. You use less fertilizer, less inputs, but you also get less out. So the benefits are local, but the impacts are global because somebody else has to pick up the slack. Mm-hmm. With intensive agriculture, that's that global sustainability. The impacts are local, eutrophication, soil compaction, other things, but it produces a lot. So the benefits are global because somebody else doesn't have to make up the difference. Mm-hmm. Instead of thinking of them as like good or bad or right or wrong agriculture, we should just recognize that it's a continuum from that local to global sustainability, and there will always be trade-offs between the two. The real question we should be asking is, where should we take a lighter touch, and where can we afford to be a little bit more intensive in our farming system? And I think that with the gene editing bill, it's sort of a recognition that we can't achieve the goals we have without new technologies. And that means new advancements in organic practices and regenerative practices, but also in new technologies as well. And so we need that full toolkit in order to do it, because we don't have forever. Like, we have this narrow window. And so I think when you're thinking about how to do that, what's important is that we want transparent, predictable, and science-based regulations. And that's critical because, one, you can do research if you know that, if I spend the next 5 years doing something, I'll be able to get a product out the other end. And you can invest if you know that there's predictability in the regulatory system. And if you have the regulatory burden too high, in other words, if it's higher than it needs to be, right, because you should have risk-appropriate regulation. But if it's higher than it needs to be, that means you just won't get as much technology out the other end. And so the more fit for purpose it is, the more opportunities come out of it. But I do think, there are a variety of new products that are going to come out of, gene editing, some of which are really going to be virtually the same as what you could have done with conventional breeding, but just faster. You have the gene, and the gene is in a crop that you want it to be in, but it's in a wild relative. And so I can spend the next 20 years doing back crosses to get it into, the current best variety, which won't be in 20 years. Or I could just edit a version of that gene in the current one. And so I found it in one, and then I can, help to recreate it in a current variety. And that can just dramatically accelerate the pace of change without increasing the risk. Because, we know it's fine because it's already in a different variety of apple or other product.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. I'm a plant molecular biologist, so I'm all for its use. And I also work with a wild relative of apple. And I do wonder, though, what cognitive biases have I got? Because when you display it like that, when you talk about the risk associated with a known gene, pulling it from one to the other, what are the blind spots that we're missing? Like, what are the risks that we haven't explored that we should be exploring, if there are any?
Well, there's certainly risks, but I think the opportunity is that what gene you're, adapting or modifying. And so you can study that, and you can have and then you can assess its impact on the rest of the genome. Yeah. And with traditional breeding, it tended to be much more random.
Yes.
We have marker-assisted selection now that allows us to accelerate breeding. But, by and large, you might have a new variety that turns out to be insect resistant, and, guess what? It has a toxin. Mm-hmm. and that happens in conventional breeding.
Yes.
But we've figured out how to identify those risks and ensure that they don't end up in the food. But I think for many of us, people have never cared more nor known less how their food is produced. And because they care, they're asking things of scientists and farmers and food companies. But because they're so far removed from it, they don't necessarily, what they ask for may not deliver what they want.
Yeah.
And that's, again, part of why we have to have that conversation. But I think as scientists, we need to recognize that there are risks. It's just that by and large, we know how to assess those risks. And I think it's not fair to say there's no risk. It's just there's a process, and
Yes.
that process
Right.
will identify the risk and, will ensure that the final product is safe, just as it always has been with conventional breeding.
Yeah, and you talked earlier about the relativity of things, and compared to conventional breeding, gene editing is far more precise. And so when you're mixing a whole genome's worth of genes together, you probably, relative to conventional breeding, we're probably talking about less risk. And as you say, there's processes to checking the food that we're creating. So
Yeah, so I've often said that, it's often easier to make people worried about how we produce food today than it is to make them less worried about future technologies. Mm-hmm. And an example of like what that looks like in practice, if I were to look at a seedless watermelon, your listeners might wonder, it's like, well, how do you get a seedless watermelon? They don't have any seeds. And so I did a little research on the internet, so I'm pretty sure it's true. You expose the watermelon to colchicine, which is a natural plant extract, which of course is also highly toxic and mutagenic. And then you end up with a watermelon with 4 sets of chromosomes, but it still produces seeds. And so you cross it back with the original watermelon, and you end up with a watermelon with 3 sets of chromosomes, which is so screwed up it will not produce seeds. And that's the one we eat. There's no food safety evaluation of that. And that's conventional breeding. And I'm not trying to encourage people not to eat the seedless watermelon, but to point out it's like, wow, if somebody were saying produced with toxins or produced with mutagens or 3 sets of chromosomes, I mean, you can imagine the probably like,
Yes.
I don't do chromosomes, right? DNA, that's my doctor said that's bad for me. And so, so it would be easy to make people worried about something that, we have 50 years of experience that says this is totally fine. Mm-hmm. But if you can communicate that in a way that gets people laughing and they're like, wow, that sounds crazy, but it's apparently fine.
Yeah.
Then all of a sudden you're exposing them to the science of it in a way that is actually kind of interesting. And that's that difference between, trying to convince somebody with the science and engaging them in science.
Would you go to the lengths of explaining all of the methodology to create the seedless watermelon, including the triploid state that's infertile? And would you need to go that far to deliver transparency? Or is that overburdening the consumer? Like, how far do we go?
I think for the most part, they don't want to know.
Yeah.
McDonald's communication team was trying to convince the company at one point to put all of their ingredients online. And there was a tremendous amount of resistance, but eventually they were successful in convincing them to put it all online. And then leadership came back and said, hey, nobody's visiting the website. And the comms guys are like, yes, that's right. People just feel more comfortable knowing it's there. And that's often enough. And so transparency doesn't mean like beating people up with the information. It's making sure that they have access to the information when they want it, where they expect it to be. And so that's all important. But another thing I think is worth keeping in mind is that in my experience, controversy around science is almost never about science. And what I mean by that is, I'll give you an example. You're probably familiar with the Impossible Burger, and it's made with genetically engineered heme. But imagine for a moment that Monsanto created the Impossible Burger. Mm. Well, I think we know that it probably wouldn't have been wildly successful, but almost every newspaper in the world would have said, what were they thinking? The public will never buy a GMO burger, which isn't true, right? And Monsanto might have responded to that by trying to explain the safety of the product, the regulatory path that they took it down. And they wouldn't have been talking about trust, and they wouldn't have been talking about engaging with the public on the thing that must actually matter, because it's clearly not about the science. But the public would have articulated a problem about science. And so they're engaging in the conversation it seems like the public wants to have, but it's really a different conversation they want. And so pretty much all the time that we end up in a debate about science, it's really about trust, it's about values, it's about a lot of things, but it's seldom about the science.
Really great point that you bring up around trust. I've heard you say that people fear food, and yet the food has never been safer. And of course, food safety, revolves around things like foodborne illnesses and other risks to health. And so in that regard, it has never been safer. But people's fear of food also arises from misinformation around nutritional advice. And in your book, you talk about the change in the 1980s around the US government issuing its first dietary guidelines, which other countries soon followed. And that recommended the cutting back of saturated fats and cholesterol, leading to an increase of sugar intake through low-fat diets. And the story is controversial and in many ways sparked a change in obesity rates, and it's a controversial story, which definitely depleted trust and certainly food regulation processes. So how do we address people's fear of food that derives from misinformation, and how can consumers begin to trust the food policy regulation process and the decisions going forward?
Yeah, so a lot of that problem, it wasn't so much about misinformation, it was about our untrustworthy brain. And, what happened is that the government, back in the 70s was trying to figure out, like, every good story needs a villain. And so they had, do we go after sugar or do we go after fat? And after a lot of discussion, they decided to make fat the villain of the dietary guideline story. And companies did kind of what you would hope they would do. They said, we should reduce fat intake. So they created low-fat versions of mayonnaise and salad dressing and all of these different products. But then our brains got involved. And our brains thought, if one low-fat cookie is good for me, the entire box is going to be great. Mm-hmm. And so it kind of gave us permission to overconsume products that had this health halo. And so I don't think anybody sort of anticipated that that was going to be the case because, of course, low fat doesn't mean low sugar. It can mean higher sugar in order to balance the taste and the flavors. And so it led us down this path, and it's a little bit of a reductionist path that, somebody's worried about one thing, well, then a food company reduces it, but they often have to put other things in there because you still want it to taste good. Mm-hmm. And the companies are trying to give you what you want, but maybe what you really want is healthful food, but you're not articulating that in the choices that you're making in terms of where you go. I think another example of that is just portion sizes. Plates in the United States went from 7 to 9 inch average in 1960 to 10, 11, 12 inches today. And so a 12-inch plate, you're going to put 20, 30, 40% more food on it and still look the same because we normally judge how much we can eat visually. And you might think, well, restaurants are like forcing food on me. The problem is that we go back to the restaurants that give us good value for our money. And for a restaurant, the food isn't the driver of cost. It's labor and real estate. And so if they give you an appropriate size, you just don't come back. So, kind of what are they supposed to do? And so we have these entire societal challenges that are changing the culture, and that change of the culture is leading us down these rabbit holes. And every country in the world is following the U.S. 42% of Americans are obese, 75% are overweight or obese, but every country in the world is following that same trajectory. In fact, before 1970, obesity rates in the United States were lower than most of Europe. So, this is like, the last 50 years, 100% of this problem. And so it's complicated. There's not a single solution, unless it's Ozempic or these new diet weight loss drugs. We can get into that if you want, but it is a complicated environment.
When we think about the goal and the challenge ahead and the different players needed to help redesign food systems, which levers or nudges in a different direction have the potential to have the greatest impact to get the desired pace of change that we need?
Yeah, I think when I was writing the book, I was thinking that we could sort of bring people together and create social movements, and those movements would really shift the dial. I think what I've seen is that there hasn't been as much of an appetite for doing it that way. So I suspect that we do need more policy intervention in order to deliver some of these impacts. But it really needs to be at that societal level. It's hard to intervene in a single way and not shove the system in different directions. And, an example of that would be that in the U.S., there are a lot of places that are focused on something like a soda tax. And, soda seems like a pretty good thing to go after because, it's sort of empty calories. The problem is that, soda consumption in America is at a 30-year low and obesity is at a 30-year high. And so if you spend your social capital on that thing, you're probably not going to solve the problem because obviously the problem continues to grow and consumption is declining. On the other hand, when you look at places that have implemented soda taxes, you do see declines in obesity, but then when you dive into the data, what you find is that higher income people are losing weight and sort of lower income are not. And so, sort of the healthy get healthier with these policies. And obviously our goal is to improve everybody's outcomes. And so it's good to be able to test these ideas in, one place, but we really need to tackle them in a bigger way. And right now there's a focus on things like ultra-processed foods. And I'm not somebody who wants to demonize all ultra-processed foods, but by the time they become 60 to 70% of our diet, that's what's problematic. At 10% or 20%, they could be just fine. But then how do you regulate to move it from 70% down to 10 or 15% without taxing the people who are struggling the most? These end up being regressive taxes. Making bad food expensive doesn't make good food cheap. And so I think, we're still exploring what that could look like. Some of the approaches that people are talking about are things like food as medicine. Could it be that you go to the doctor and you get a prescription for fruit and vegetables, and then you go and you hand it over, and every week you get a basket of fruit and vegetables. So that could increase consumption, makes it more accessible, more affordable. And this is a big deal because the cost of our current food system, according to the Food and Agriculture Organization, is about $10 to $12 trillion globally. The cost of the U.S. economy is about $1 trillion. And that's mostly diet-related illnesses. And so, wouldn't it be better to spend $1 trillion keeping people healthy than $1 trillion making sick people less sick? And so I think our current food system and our healthcare system need to work more closely together in order to, create healthier outcomes for people.
That sounds like an incredibly important lever, a very efficient one for driving change. I love the idea of a prescription for fruit and veg.
Yeah.
That's great. In your book, you describe growing up around sustainable, self-sufficient food production at home. Being close to food production, one can appreciate the time and effort and resource required to make good food. Do you think it matters that people are connected to food production? And if it does, what's the best way to do this, particularly for urban populations?
Yeah, now to be clear, we had our family garden and we produced most of the food that we ate. That was corn and cantaloupe and watermelon and strawberries and green beans and peppers and tomatoes and onions and all of those things. And I hated every day I worked in that garden. So,
yeah.
And, it was all organic, but not for philosophical reasons. We had child labor, which was me and my brothers, and we had small hands and could pick off the bugs. So I think that gives you a great appreciation of what it takes to put food on the table. But it's also just not realistic to imagine that most people are going to be able to go back to that kind of farming. But I do think there's an opportunity, for kids in schools to be introduced to food and food production and whole foods so that will translate throughout their entire lives. And so I think engaging kids early is one way of helping to reshape the future of our food system. I think we saw this with things like recycling, that when you started talking to kids about recycling and they go home and they say, well, we can't throw away that cardboard, then parents, change what they do rather than, trying to convince busy parents that are working 2 jobs and coming home late and, they're taking a bus to go to the grocery store or something, to just add one more thing to their life. Mm-hmm. I think most people are doing the best they can. And we need to do what we can to make it easier for them instead of burdening them or blaming them for not doing even more.
Yes, I think you actually refer to it as making the healthy choice the easy choice.
Yes.
Yeah. Would that extend to indoor vertical farms within cities, changing the concept of the farm gate being, next door to your apartment building in the middle of the city?
I think that can be a good way of bringing people closer to agriculture. It's less clear if it's going to be sort of the most sustainable solution. Mm-hmm. Okay. There are some things that you can do in vertical farms that are relatively efficient. But when you think about a vertical farm, the drivers of cost tend to be energy and real estate. Mm-hmm. And you move to a rural economy and, real estate's cheap and sunlight's free. And so their cost drivers make it challenging unless it's just very high value products. on the other hand, the ability to somebody to go and see food and pick it themselves, I think can be transformative. When kids, first realize like, oh, that's what a potato looks like. I was, it doesn't look anything like a French fry or mashed potatoes or whatever it might be. I think, that's the kind of thing that opens their eyes, or to, try some type of greens that they just haven't been exposed to before and make it more tangible. And I think that's useful for all of us to have that tactile experience.
In your book, you talk about people that have studied the blue zone areas where people live the longest. And there's a real mix of factors that make it possible to have that result, often around having the healthy choice, the easy choice, moving around a lot, having a community that's connected and helps one another. Is this still a possibility, especially for, I hate to keep going on about urban populations, but with urban populations becoming more common and growing, how do we recreate the blue zone philosophy in these areas?
Yeah, and so that's some of the work of Daniel Buettner. And I think that we all crave having a sense of belonging. And I think that it's one of the things that hurts us mentally not to know our neighbors, not to be associated with the people around us. There is a crisis, a global crisis of loneliness. And I think being able to redesign our cities so that they actually deliver more of that, instead of going out to the big box suburban shops, and instead of having local shops that you walk to and visit. I think that cities of the future will try to recreate more of that sense of community, and that people will like those cities more. It's a little bit like a competition of different types. And I think over time, we're probably going to move more towards that idea that, you should have walkable cities. Cities shouldn't be designed for cars. They should be designed for people. And that's going to shift what they look like. And if there are fewer cars, then you want things closer by. And if you want things closer by, then you're going to run into more people that on a regular basis. And so it's going to shift just how we exist. And so I do think we're beginning to see that with some cities in Europe and some other places that are really redesigning the city with the public in mind.
And how does food system design enable that? Like, how does it intersect? What's the optimal food system design to encourage that?
I don't know if there's an optimal design, but I do think, we always just have to keep in mind the trade-offs.
Yeah.
And,
yeah.
Not every city in the world has an agricultural system close enough by to be able to buy local. And buying local doesn't necessarily mean the most sustainable, as I'm sure people who are producing New Zealand lamb and dairy, like to remind people that it can still have a lower footprint. But there are other benefits to buying local, and that can be social and economic as well, having that vibrant community around the city. And so I think we need to keep in mind that everything is not about efficiency, that, living in a place and enjoying it, all of a sudden we might be willing to spend a little bit more money on something that we're connected to. And it's complicated because, on one hand, today we spend the smallest amount of our income on food sort of in the history of the world, and yet many people are still struggling, right? And so there's that, how can that be? Well, I don't know how it can be, but it's true. And we need to make sure that when we're redesigning these cities, it's not just making it more expensive for everybody, so that, again, the healthy get healthier and the rich have nice walkable cities, and everybody else has to be in a place that doesn't have those things. And so I think it's part of it is just having local food councils and others that are keeping in mind the entire population and not sort of optimizing it for a handful of us that have the ability to live in those wonderful places.
Yeah. Just touch on the influence of integrating and communicating within the whole food system pipeline. For a while, you led the Food Systems Institute at the University of Nottingham in England. And this institute covered many aspects of the food system, from genomics and food tech to human rights, geography and policy. And that had the advantage of enabling greater integration of approaches. There are many siloed approaches influencing the food system redesign. So what do we need to do to work better together to integrate the implementation pathways and essentially achieve greater overall impact within the system? What's the secret?
Well, I think, we didn't do all of those things. Part of my job was to connect the research across the university to scale the impact of what we do.
Yeah.
So our job was to help everybody to do better at what they were already doing, and then kind of to serve as an ambassador for that research to the world, to go out and talk about what was being done, to build partnerships, engage in global dialogues, to help take that research to the world. And I think that's an important part, though, is that, too often organizations, and whether it's a university or government or others, can become siloed, and they miss the opportunity for that sort of cross-pollination across the organization. And just by bringing two people together, you can do a better job at whatever it is you wanted to do. And you mentioned some of the human rights work that was happening on campus. And for many people, they would never find that institute if they were just looking at the university, because it's part of human rights. It's not part of the food program. And so we're helping them to tell their story to the people who actually care about what they're doing. Same thing with psychology colleagues that were working on consumer insights. We're the ones who are super excited about their next publication. And I'm sure that their psychology colleagues were as well, but they didn't really do the same thing. Mm-hmm. And so the more we can bring people together, it's a synergy. It's not a zero-sum game. We actually can do better faster by bringing together people and understanding what their strengths and weaknesses are and seeing if we can help to fix that. And a big part of what I was also doing, though, was how do you translate that into policy? Mm-hmm. So facilitating that dialogue between researchers and policymakers. And we did that in a few ways. One is that I talked to a lot of the 27 schools at the university, from pharmacy and medicine and vet and all of that, about, every time you publish a paper, you should ask yourself, is there a policy angle to this? And if there is, could I get a second publication where I explain why it's important? And the value of that is, one, you get a second publication for free because you've probably done the hard work, but it reaches the audience you actually want to reach, who could then make use of that idea. And so you actually have a better shot at having influence by doing that. Another piece of advice to my research colleagues was, every time you do a grant proposal that doesn't get funded, that's a policy paper. So, because you've done the hard work, what's the problem, what research needs to be done, and what are the implications of this research, right?
Yeah.
And so now if you publish that, and then next year you go to do another grant proposal on the same topic, you can point to your own publication in order to get that next grant. And so they love that idea.
I love that idea too. That's great.
So people
Great
were constantly saying, okay, here was our grant proposal. What's the policy angle here? And so that was a lot of fun.
That's wonderful, connecting all the dots along the chain. You mentioned in your talks also, and you mentioned at the beginning of the podcast as well, the need to focus on how we communicate our ideas to reduce polarisation, to ultimately work better together. And I'm sure you saw a lot of that in your role at University of Nottingham. When our brains are so keen on mental shortcuts and to interpret things as either or rather than both and, this seems like a tall order to try and combat polarisation. So are you seeing good examples of good communication? Should we be teaching these skills in school and in our organisations? What do we need to do to bring good communication and avoidance of polarisation to the forefront of our minds?
So this is really my top priority at UCLA, is building out our capacity on the science and psychology of science communication. How can we communicate to bring people together to solve problems? And sometimes it's a small change. And I'll give you an example. One of the researchers that I worked with at Nottingham had done a talk for some farmers who are sort of regenerative farmers. And he works on regenerative soil, so these should be his people. But he said, it didn't go as well as I expected. They just didn't seem as open. And I said, well, how did you talk about it? And he said, well, I was talking about moving from intensive farming systems to these regenerative farming systems. And I said, so you were telling them to stop being bad farmers, and you were going to tell them how to be a good farmer. And he kind of winced, and he's like, well, maybe it came across like that. And I said, well, what if instead you said farming in the UK is becoming more regenerative? Here are some ways of accelerating the transition. Mm-hmm. You would have said the same thing, but they would have been leaning in saying, tell me more, right? And so often it's something as small as how we frame the conversation, that if somebody doesn't know you, they don't know that you have their best interest in heart and your job is to make their lives easier and better. And when it's a stranger, we can sometimes assume that they're not trying to save the planet. And whereas, our friends and our family, they think stupid things all the time. Some of them are idiots, but we love them, right? And so, we don't assume they're bad people because they're wrong, and probably the same how they think about us. And so sometimes it can be that small. Otherwise, though, I think when we have something where maybe we really disagree with somebody else, we want to explain the facts to them, like we want to tell them the hard truth. And the problem is that, I hear people all the time say, I want to talk about the facts. I want to deliver the hard truth. I want to say it like it is. Mm-hmm. Well, what I hear is I'm going to say something. I know it's not going to change their minds, but I'm going to say it anyway.
Okay.
Right?
Yeah.
And because, that's what it means. I'm going to tell it like it is. It's like, okay, you're going to be ineffective, but let's go with it. And as soon as I realize that something I want to say is not going to land, it's up to me to say it differently, or just to accept the fact that I'm going to be ineffective. And so I think, again, recognizing that, we sometimes are our own worst enemies. And then the last would be, instead of engaging somebody in a conversation where you're trying to change their mind, engaging them in a conversation where you're trying to understand their mind.
Yeah, 100%.
And, that could look like, instead of trying to convince somebody that gene editing is great, say it's like, well, on a scale of 1 to 10, how strongly do you support gene editing? And they're like, I'm a 2, and 1 is, not at all. And so it's like, okay, well, why aren't you a 1? Well, then maybe all of a sudden they're like, oh, well, I guess it could end up having some good positive impact. Like they're all of a sudden explaining to you what the potential benefits are.
Yeah.
Because they've thought about it a little bit, and they've got some, and it's like, it might not turn out to be unsafe. And so you end up in a conversation where they're talking to you about what they think, and you're learning, and they're learning how they think about it themselves. Mm-hmm. And, it's the same for us. If somebody says, how confident are you that gene editing is going to save the world? I guess I'm about a 7 out of 10 and it's because it's going to contribute to saving the world. Like, it's not going to do it on its own. It's not a silver bullet. It's part of a range of solutions. And, somebody's like, well, why am I not a 10? It's like, well, other things could turn out to be way more important. Yeah. And, it's only part of the solution. And it's like, I would be explaining, it's like, and maybe something doesn't work out the way we expect, and maybe it turns out to be more expensive. And, so that openness to a dialogue and a conversation is just very different than trying to convince somebody of something.
100%. I love that framing of, like, where do you sit on the scale, even for yourself, you know, to check that. It's a great way to uncover your biases as well. And I was going to ask how important it is when you say, if you know you're not going to land something with somebody, how do you know whether something will land, and whether it's important to think that you have the same kind of shared vision of the future? You also talked about people wanting to save the planet. Do we all want to save the planet? Are we assuming that everybody does? How important is it to have the shared vision of the future and be aligned with that? But maybe it's not about that at all. Maybe it's not having a shared vision of the future and just checking your scale and adjusting.
I think it's both. I do think having a vision for the future that we can all agree on is a really powerful thing. And I think some people think, well, that's hard to do, to get people who have very diametrically opposed views to agree on something. But it's actually much easier to get them to agree on the future than it is to agree on tomorrow. And I'll give you an example. I've spoken to probably 5,000 or 10,000 beef and dairy farmers over the last 2 years about the future of protein. And what I asked them, I said, look, I've got 3 scenarios for the future of protein. Scenario 1, I call livestock wins. We expand animal ag to meet future protein needs of 25 to 75% more protein. Scenario 2, alternative proteins win, or beans and lentils or something. They expand and meet future need. And then scenario 3, livestock goes bust. We produce 20% less animal protein in 2050 than we do today. And then I ask them, which future is best for you guys? And they all raise their hand and say, scenario 1, we want livestock to win. And then I point out, well, in scenario 1, we cut down 10% of our forest. People don't like the environmental impact. But most importantly, you don't make more money. Because if demand increases and supply increases, your income has to be flat. Mm-hmm. You can't make more money in scenario 1. Scenario 2, demand for real meat increases. Supply is flat. You have to be making more money in scenario 2. And without the environmental consequences, people are okay with you. Scenario 3, we reduced production in the least productive countries on the planet. That's not New Zealand, that's not the US, that's not the UK. Well, now you're making 4 or 5 times more money. We take 60% of land out of production because that's how unproductive the least productive 20% is, and you are an ultra premium product that people are fighting for. And then I ask them again, which future is best for you, for your family, for your country? 95% will switch and say, you know what? I think scenarios 2 and 3 actually look pretty darn good. Right? And so now you have, beef and dairy farmers saying the future they want is the one where livestock loses. And, because it's a future in which they could thrive.
Yeah.
If we can describe a future that people want to live in, they'll be with us. And if we describe a future they don't want, don't expect them to get on board.
Nice. I love it. And it also takes consideration of all of those trade-offs and that huge breadth of consideration of the whole food system when you're coming up with that future, not just looking at one isolated thing. So lastly, what are you most excited about? What gives you the greatest hope for the future, either in the food system redesign or in the world more generally?
Well, I am 100% focused on the science and psychology of science communication. I believe that we absolutely can talk about these problems in a way that brings people together and that people want to come together. And it's really just about us doing a better job of engaging them to make it happen.
Wow, great. I'm sure there's plenty of people lining up to learn how to communicate better. Well, it has been an immense pleasure talking to you today. We appreciate your generosity and sharing your time and your learnings and your thoughts about the future of food systems. Thank you for being on the podcast today.
Thank you very much.
And thank you out there for listening. If you'd like to know more about the topics covered on SciGest, check out the episode pages on the Plant and Food Research website. Please also subscribe to or follow the SciGest channel and rate and review each episode. Thank you and mā te wā.